Hello, spiritual seekers. Let's dive into the shadow. Specifically, how do we do shadow work for spiritual awakening? My name is John Moore, and I am a spiritual teacher. I specialize in shamanism, but also some other stuff. I live in Maine in the US, and the shadow is one of my favorite topics. So let's talk about what it is. Let's talk about why it is absolutely critical for spiritual development, spiritual work, and let's give you some practical tips for how to do shadow work for spiritual awakening. Well, let me start by saying that the term the shadow, as I'm going to use it today, comes from the psychoanalyst Carl Jung. And Carl Jung said, and I'm going to paraphrase this quote a little bit, that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the shadow parts conscious. A lot of people know that quote. They might not know the second half of the quote. The second half of the quote says that the latter, most people don't want to do, and I'm paraphrasing because it's a pain in the ass, right? It's not necessarily much fun, and can be painful and brings up a lot of things. So, what is the shadow? I'm going to narrow it down to hopefully a really tiny, easily digestible definition. The shadow is a complex of the exiled parts of ourselves that we don't look at. We don't hold them in our conscious mind because they're too painful for us to look at. What are some examples of some things that are in our shadow? Hidden desires that we've rejected because we feel, due to our education, our parenting, our upbringing, our culture, the media, we've been told those are unacceptable and that we'll be shunned or will be judged or whatever, right? We have shame around them. Shame, I'm going to talk about shame again in a moment, but shame is a strong indicator that there's something in the shadow. The shadow holds our hidden desires. It holds our wounds that we don't want to look at. A lot of traumatic stuff gets thrown into the shadow because it's so painful. It is, it feels like it's at risk to our lives to even pull it up. And this is why we get triggered sometimes. And I'll bring triggers up in a moment as well. So the shadow is this big part of us that we never look at. Um, So why don't we just want to let things stay there? We threw them in there for a reason, right? It was painful to look at that stuff. It's painful to have that, bring that stuff and make it conscious. And according to Jung, hardly anybody wants to do it, right? Well, the problem is that the stuff in our shadow is running our lives from behind the scenes. It's sort of like the Wizard of Oz. It's the actual guy behind the curtain pulling the levers. This isn't to say that everything we do is a result of unconscious processes, but most of it is. Most of the choices we make, most of the decisions we make start as unconscious processes. We don't know it because they are unconscious, right? Even brain scans show us this. When they use functional MRIs with people, they show that decisions that they make start in the unconscious limbic part of the brain and then come forward into the prefrontal cortex where we build a little logic around it. And then we go, that sure was a logical decision I just made there, wasn't it? And there may have been some logic to it, but it's coming out of your hidden parts. And so we want to step into our spiritual sovereignty. We want to awaken to our true nature. We don't want to reject parts of ourselves. Now, there is an aspect to the shadow that comes, the way that it ties into our ego is that we say, well, listen, if I embrace these shadow aspects of myself and they're hidden and they're dark, and maybe I've got some dark desires, maybe I'm a serial killer, maybe I'm, whatever. And the truth of the matter is, you aren't, and unless you are already, right? Um, Shadow stuff, embracing it, bringing it to light, becoming conscious of it is not the same thing as acting on deep, dark, evil desires, right? We're not acting on our desires to necessarily hurt somebody else, right? So let me give you an example. I'm driving down the road, somebody cuts me off, right? Now I might get a little angry at that because, geez, they almost made me crash, and then I let it go. But for some people, they get enraged, right? They get triggered. Those triggers are coming from the shadow, and they might talk about some wound about being respected, or some wound about having your life risked, or some wound about, projecting, oh, that person's stupid, and what are all these things we say about this person we've never met. We've only seen them behave for about 30 seconds, and we've made all these judgments about them. That's all coming up out of our shadow, right? And maybe we even have the desire, man, I sure would like to run that person off the road and punch them in the nose. Well, even if you have that desire, most people, and even if you say, oh, that comes from somewhere in my shadow, I'm going to raise up that part of my unconscious and make it conscious, I am not all of a sudden going to start punching people in the nose. I still have free will. I still can choose what I'm doing. In fact, you have less free will. The more your shadow is unconscious, you actually have less free will. You have the illusion of free will than you do if you make this stuff conscious. You go, oh, I was just triggered by that. That has something to do with my, you know, hurt feelings about not being respected, my boundaries not being respected, or somebody hurting me in my past, right? Then I can make a choice about how I react to that. It's about becoming responsive, not reactive. All of our reactive behavior comes out of the shadow. All of our being triggered comes out of the shadow. And what happens when we push things down, we see this with a lot of spiritual teachers and a lot of spiritual leaders, right? Is that they reach a very high levels of spiritual ability, but they don't do their cleanup work, which is going into the shadow and addressing that stuff. And if you don't do that work, there's a real risk there. The risk is even greater. The more spiritual development work you do without doing shadow work, the risk is very high that you'll hurt yourself or somebody else. I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, you don't have to go very far to find these stories of these gurus that have been sexually abusing their followers, or their, enlightened teacher who winds up, killing themselves, taking their own lives, or drinking themselves to death, or whatever. All of these things are outcroppings of shadow that are actually amplified by the spiritual development, by the spiritual awakening, right? So Ken Wilber, who I really love to read his stuff. He is absolutely prolific, but he talks about spirituality from kind of three angles. And he talks about waking up, growing up, and cleaning up. Now, waking up is about becoming spiritually awakened. It's about understanding the nature of who you are as a divine being from an experiential standpoint. It's about taking on a non-dual consciousness, right? That's waking up. And that's what most people are like, oh, once I do that, I'm enlightened. Maybe. But then there's also growing up. And growing up is about how we act in the world, right? Even though I know that I'm a part of divinity, I'm also operating through this mind body, and the things I do impact other people and the world. If I, litter and pollute my environment, I'm harming other people and other beings. If I use hurtful words, if I have hurtful actions. So we clean up and we take responsibility for ourselves. We grow up and we take responsibility for ourselves and our actions and the outcomes of our actions. And the third part is cleanup, and that is shadow work. That's cleaning up the garbage that has been installed there. It's installed by our parents, whether they absolutely loved us unconditionally or not. We learn stuff from them. Not all of it's great. From our culture. Not, you can point to any culture in the world and find pluses and minuses to it. But culture pushes down on us like pressure, like being under the ocean. And there's pressure pushing down on us to conform, to fit in, to not be exiled, right? And from our education, from our media, okay? Even things that, things that happen to us get thrown into our shadow. So we got to start, we have to do that cleanup work simply so that we can be more fully in our divinity, right? ultimately it will help us spiritually awaken because we have all of these base drives that are in here, all of these really, um, you know, they're not bad. They're just parts of us that we've thrown back there. Okay, we think they're bad. We judge them. And really, we get into a state of self love when we stop judging these parts of ourselves. Now, not judging them doesn't mean like, oh, I've got the desire to punch that guy in the nose who just cut me off in traffic. That doesn't make me a bad person. It just means that is a desire that has arisen up from my shadow. It's the judgment and the shame that gets us into the problem. Like, oh, that, when something like that occurs, oh, that's interesting. I wonder where that came from, is a healthier perspective than, oh my God, I have to push that down. What a terrible thing for me to think. I must be a terrible person because terrible people have terrible ideas and terrible actions and whatever. Okay, so you don't need to act on any of it, but making the root of this more conscious. We do that by exploring things. I'm going to give you some practical ways to do that. Helps bring you towards spiritual awakening. It helps you recognize that you are not apart from the world, you're a part of the world. Okay? And all of this that's going on out here is actually going on in here, right? We just see it out here. We're projecting. And this is a mechanism of the shadow, is projection. So one thing you can do is look at how you judge other people. Now, granted, when you judge other people, you will find lots of logic to justify. This is what we do. We have a feeling, we have a judgment, we make a snap judgment, we're triggered, whatever. And then our prefrontal cortex says, let's make lots of sense of that. Let's put some logic around that. Good example of that is sales. If you ever go out to buy something, if emotion didn't figure into it, all cars would be the same color, right? But I want a red one, or I want a blue one, or I want a gray one, or whatever it is that speaks to you. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just we make buying decisions based on emotion, and that is proven out by brain science. And that stuff is coming from back here. We can make clearer decisions when we bring that stuff and make it conscious, right? And we do it with acceptance. We accept who we are fully. That's what love is. Love is complete acceptance. I'm not rejecting any part of myself any longer. Once you do that, once you start to work through this stuff, once you start to do your shadow work for spiritual awakening, you will live more and more in a state of love and in a state of bliss. And you'll realize that these are components of spiritual awakening. They're symptoms, they're markers of spiritual awakening. One is a shift away from ego consciousness, where I see myself as completely separate from everything else. And that I see myself as a part of everything else, or everything else is occurring in my experience. Everything is arising, every experience is arising as part of my consciousness, which is the universal consciousness. Spiritual awakening is also marked out by more bliss and more of an experience of love and acceptance of others. There's less of a difference between you and I. We might look different, we might act different, we might speak differently. Underneath it all, there is but one consciousness. We start to realize that when we integrate our shadow parts and realize that those parts exist in different forms in all other people as well, and that we're not apart from them. So if you are a spiritual seeker, you're interested in spiritual awakening, you must. I very rarely say that. I very rarely say should. You must do shadow work. It's one thing you really can't bypass. And if you do try to bypass it, it is going to cost you. It will cost you progress. It may cost you even more than you might expect. But you got to do your shadow cleanup work. So here's a couple of hints towards starting to do shadow work, right? And the first part is just make the stuff conscious. Every time you're triggered, write it down. Write down the date, what happened, and how you reacted. And then go through those and start to look at, every so often, go through your trigger journal and recognize patterns. What's going on with you? What Also look at, what are your hidden desires? What are things that you might desire that you've never told anybody? And this isn't to say you need to act on them, especially if acting on them would harm somebody else, but recognize that those are coming from somewhere, right? Look at incidences from childhood that really stuck with you, good and bad. What are some good things, what are bad things that have stuck with you for seemingly forever? What memories stick out in your head? They're linked to something in your shadow. All right. And then a big one for spiritual folks is look at how you project onto other people. If you want to know if you are projecting on somebody else, if you have any judgment whatsoever, simply that's good, that's bad, I like that, I don't like that. Um, that's projection. There's 100% projection. Any judgment whatsoever, good or bad, it's projection. It's coming from somewhere inside of you. And that is a really, really good indicator of where you are with your shadow work, right? Um, Love is the opposite of projection. Love is just complete acceptance of the person. We often think of it as, I just think this is the best person. It's a really good person. I really want to be with this person. I desire to possess this person. That's not love. I'll do a whole other video describing spiritual love. But that's what it is. It's complete and utter acceptance of the other. And then in actuality, it's not seeing the other as the other, right? It's simply allowing them to be as they are, completely without judgment, and recognizing that we're all part of the same whole. I hope that's helpful. I love you all, and now you know what I mean when I say that, and I will talk to you very soon.